When we talk about rage baiting, we're really talking about a very old manipulation tactic dressed up in very modern clothing. At its core, rage baiting is the intentional use of provocative, inflammatory, or offensive content designed to make you angry enough to react. Not to think, not to reflect, just to react. And that distinction matters because anger is one of the fastest emotions to activate in the human nervous system. It bypasses nuance, it shuts down curiosity, and it pulls you straight into a fight-or-flight state. That's why this tactic works so reliably. The reason this term rose to the level of being named a word of the year isn't because it's new, but because it has become unavoidable. We're living in a digital environment where outrage is rewarded and emotional escalation is normalized. Rage bait shows up as deliberately cruel comments, misleading headlines, exaggerated opinions, or posts that seem almost designed to insult your intelligence or your values. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, I can't believe someone would say this, that's often the hook. The goal isn't truth or dialogue, it's engagement. What makes rage bait particularly insidious is that it convinces you that responding is necessary. You feel morally obligated to correct, to explain, to defend, or to fight back. But the moment you engage, the trap has already worked. Your emotional energy becomes the currency. Your anger becomes the fuel, and the person or system behind the bait gets exactly what they wanted: attention, amplification, and control over the emotional tone of the interaction. This matters psychologically because chronic exposure to rage bait doesn't just make us angry in the moment, it reshapes how we see the world. Over time, it can make everything feel more hostile, more polarized, more unsafe. It trains us to expect attack, to stay on edge, and to respond defensively, even when it's not warranted. That's not accidental. A dysregulated audience is easier to manipulate. Understanding what rage baiting is, and recognizing it in real time, is the first step in reclaiming your emotional agency. Because once you see the hook, you're no longer obligated to bite. And remember this, not every provocation deserves your energy, and silence can be the most powerful refusal of all. To really understand why rage baiting is so effective, we have to look at what it does to the brain and the nervous system. Anger is not a slow emotion. It doesn't knock politely and wait for you to analyze the situation. It bursts in. The moment you encounter something that feels threatening, insulting, or unjust, your brain shifts into survival mode. The amygdala lights up, stress hormones surge, and your body prepares for action. That response evolved to protect us from danger, but in the digital world, it's being exploited. When you are angry, the part of your brain responsible for reflection, nuance, and long-term thinking goes offline. You're not asking, is this accurate, or is this worth my time? You're thinking, how dare they? And I need to respond. Rage bait relies on this neurological shortcut. It doesn't want your intelligence, it wants your impulsivity. And the more emotionally charged the content, the faster that process happens. What's especially concerning is how quickly anger becomes reinforcing. When you react by commenting, sharing, or arguing, you get a hit of validation. You feel righteous. You feel energized. For a moment, it feels productive. But what's actually happening is a loop: provoke, react, escalate, repeat. Each time you engage, your nervous system becomes more sensitized. Over time, your threshold for irritation drops. You start reacting more quickly, more intensely, and with less provocation. That's not strength, that's dysregulation. This is why rage bait can feel addictive. It creates a sense of urgency and importance, even when the content itself is trivial or deliberately distorted. Your brain is being trained to associate outrage with relevance. And once that association is in place, calm, thoughtful content starts to feel boring or insufficient. That's a profound shift in how we process information. On a collective level, this constant activation keeps people divided and emotionally flooded. It reduces empathy, increases polarization, and makes meaningful dialogue almost impossible. But on an individual level, it's exhausting. Living in a state of chronic reactivity drains emotional reserves and erodes mental health. The power move here isn't winning the argument, it's regulating the reaction. Because the moment you pause, the bait loses its grip. When you look closely at rage baiting, it starts to feel very familiar, especially if you've ever dealt with a narcissistic personality. The tactics overlap almost perfectly. Provocation, invalidation, exaggeration, contempt, and that subtle sense of "I dare you" to respond. Rage baiting operates on the same fuel source narcissism does: emotional reaction. It doesn't matter whether the reaction is admiration or fury. What matters is intensity and attention. Narcissistic individuals are often deeply attuned to what will unsettle others. They know how to poke at values, identities, and vulnerabilities because those are the fastest ways to destabilize someone emotionally. Rage bait does the same thing on a mass scale. It targets hot-button issues, personal beliefs, and moral convictions, not to explore them, but to inflame them. The goal isn't connection or understanding. It's dominance through disruption. Another parallel is the illusion of debate. With narcissistic dynamics, you're often pulled into circular arguments that never resolve because resolution was never the goal. Rage bait works similarly. You can bring facts, logic, and reason, but the content isn't designed to engage honestly. It's designed to keep you emotionally hooked. And once you're hooked, the power imbalance shifts. The more upset you are, the more control the provocateur has. There's also a gaslighting component. Rage bait often reframes cruelty as just a joke, just an opinion, or people are too sensitive these days. That minimization makes you question your own reaction. You're angry, but then you're told you're overreacting. That emotional whiplash is deeply destabilizing and very familiar to anyone who's experienced narcissistic manipulation. What's especially important to understand is that engaging with rage bait often recreates the same emotional exhaustion people feel in toxic relationships. You feel compelled to explain yourself, defend your position, or prove your humanity to someone who has no interest in acknowledging it. That's not a conversation. That's emotional labor being extracted without consent. Once you recognize rage bait as a narcissistic style tactic, the strategy becomes clearer. You stop trying to win. You stop trying to convince. You start prioritizing your own emotional boundaries. Because just like with narcissistic dynamics, the healthiest response is not engagement, it's disengagement. And the moment you stop feeding the reaction, the manipulation has nowhere left to land. To fully understand why rage bait feels so unavoidable, we have to talk about the systems that quietly reward it. Social media algorithms are not neutral observers. They are engagement machines. Their job is to keep you scrolling, clicking, watching, and reacting for as long as possible. And nothing captures attention faster or longer than outrage. Calm content might inform you, but angry content hooks you. When a post triggers rage, people don't just pause on it. They comment, argue, quote share, and send it to others with captions like, "Can you believe this?" From the algorithm's perspective, that looks like success. It doesn't register whether the engagement is thoughtful, ethical, or harmful. It only sees activity. The more inflammatory the content, the more visibility it gets. Rage bait isn't a glitch in the system, it's a feature the system quietly promotes. What makes this especially troubling is how quickly the tone escalates. Subtle provocation stops working, so content becomes sharper, crueler, and more extreme to keep attention levels high. Nuance disappears. Context is stripped away. Complex issues are flattened into insults and absolutes because those are easier to react to. Over time, this trains creators to lean into outrage, even if it distorts reality or causes harm. This environment also pressures everyday users to participate. If thoughtful responses get buried and inflammatory ones get amplified, people start adapting to the tone. You may notice yourself becoming snappier, more reactive, more absolute in your thinking. That's not a personal failing, that's conditioning. The system nudges people toward emotional intensity because emotional intensity performs well. There's another layer here. Rage content spreads faster because people feel a sense of urgency. Anger convinces you that something must be addressed immediately. And once urgency is activated, discernment drops. You're less likely to fact-check, less likely to pause, and more likely to pass it on. That's how misinformation and cruelty travel so efficiently. The danger is that when outrage becomes the dominant currency, Empathy and reflection become casualties. We start seeing each other not as people, but as positions to attack or defend against. And a society locked in constant outrage is easier to divide, easier to distract, and easier to manipulate. Understanding how the algorithm works doesn't make you cynical. It makes you empowered. Because once you realize that your anger is being monetized, choosing not to engage becomes an act of resistance. And the most disruptive thing you can do in an outrage economy is refuse to be outraged on command. What often gets overlooked in all of this is the cost to the people consuming this kind of content. Rage bait isn't just annoying or irritating, it's psychologically taxing. NG. When you're repeatedly exposed to provocative, hostile, or cruel material, your nervous system doesn't get a break. It stays activated. And a nervous system that's constantly on alert starts to interpret the world as more dangerous than it actually is. Over time, this can lead to emotional exhaustion. You might notice you're more irritable, less patient, and quicker to assume bad intent in others. Things that once felt manageable start to feel overwhelming. That's because your emotional reserves are being drained by constant reactivity. Anger, even when justified, takes energy. Living in a state of near constant outrage leaves very little room for calm, creativity, or connection. There's also a cognitive cost. Rage bait thrives on simplification, and repeated exposure can shrink your tolerance for nuance. Complex issues begin to feel binary. Good versus evil, us versus them. This black and white thinking may feel clarifying in the moment, but it ultimately narrows perspective and reduces empathy. When everyone is framed as an enemy or a threat, genuine understanding becomes almost impossible. Anxiety is another common outcome. Being immersed in rage-driven content can create a sense that crises are everywhere, all the time. Even when you step away from your screen, that heightened alertness can linger. Sleep gets disrupted. Focus suffers. You may find yourself doom scrolling, not because it feels good, but because your nervous system is stuck in a loop of vigilance. And then there's the emotional distortion. Rage bait can slowly convince you that constant anger is normal, even necessary. That if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention, or you don't care, Ugh. But chronic anger doesn't make you more informed. It makes you more depleted. It erodes joy, softens curiosity, and crowds out moments of ease. The hardest part is that people often blame themselves for these effects. They think they're just too sensitive or bad at coping, when in reality they're responding normally to an abnormal amount of provocation. This isn't a personal weakness, it's exposure. Protecting your mental health in this environment starts with recognizing the impact rage bait has on you, because you cannot heal in a space that constantly demands your outrage, and your well-being is far more valuable than any argument you will never win online. So once you recognize rage bait for what it is, the question becomes, what do you actually do with that awareness? Because insight without action still leaves you vulnerable. The most effective response to rage bait is also the least satisfying one in the moment: non-engagement. And that's hard, especially if you care deeply about the issue being provoked. But disengaging isn't apathy, it's strategy. The first step is pausing your body before you engage your mind. If something spikes your anger, that's your cue to stop, not to respond. Take a breath. Notice the physical activation: tight chest, racing thoughts, clenched jaw. Those signals mean your nervous system has been hijacked, and any response you make from that state is unlikely to reflect your values. Regulation always comes before communication. Next, get selective about where your energy goes. Not every platform, comment section, or person deserves access to your emotional labor. You are allowed to mute, block, unfollow, or scroll past without explanation. Boundaries are not punishments, they're self-protection. And in an attention economy, withdrawing attention is powerful. It's also important to differentiate between meaningful dialogue and performative conflict. Real conversations involve curiosity, accountability, and a willingness to listen. Rage bait offers none of that. If the tone is contemptuous, absolutist, or mocking, that's your signal to opt out. You don't owe anyone your clarity or your calm when they're committed to chaos. Another key piece is reclaiming your informational diet. Seek out content that challenges you thoughtfully rather than emotionally. Follow voices that prioritize insight over outrage. When your feed becomes calmer, your nervous system follows. This isn't about living in a bubble, it's about choosing depth over noise. Finally, reconnect with your values offline. Rage bait pulls you into constant reaction mode, but meaning lives in action, not argument. Focus on what you can influence directly: your relationships, your work, your community, your healing. That's where real change happens. Disengaging from rage bait doesn't make you weak or uninformed. It makes you intentional. It's the choice to stop feeding systems and individuals that thrive on your dysregulation. And the ultimate act of power is refusing to give your peace to people who profit from your anger.